мне избавиться вот от этой необходимости всем разрешать присутствовать? То есть можно ли отменить это так, чтобы автоматически?
Павлович знает, как отключать. Да? Да.
Коль.
А я тогда пока не буду демонстрировать. Давайте сначала разрешайте.
Нет, безопасность. Да, безопасность. Дополнительно. Нет.
А мы не админы.
Давайте я вам сейчас передам эти самые права администратора. Сейчас. Да. А теперь тогда, Коль, ты отключи.
Вот безопасность.
Показать, вот там показать надо.
Так.
Зал ожидания наверху.
Да.
Вот сюда тык.
На ключ.
Вот.
Все.
Теперь, по идее,
Не выходит.
первым все могут сюда невозбранно заходить.
Чтобы у нас следователь.
Где, между прочим, есть специальные факультеты, которые знают лучше всякий раз, когда что-нибудь не так, почему-то вызывает меня. Мы все методом стыгаем.
Главное, никто пригласить, запомнить, собственно говоря.
Нет, запомнить это невозможно.
Невозможно, я каждый раз
Потом все будет.
Douglas, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, so you can start.
Okay, great. I want to warn everyone. I'm living in a very working class neighborhood in Bari, and sometimes my neighbors like to provide musical entertainment. So if that happens, I will move to another room. Okay. So friends, students, colleagues. Next slide, please. Many years ago, I spent a day with a group of interesting people who were full of stories and ideas, and none of whom I ever saw again. One of those people was a young academic who worked at the intersection of literary theory and national security studies, and who told me that he had recently published a theoretical article about how tourist guidebooks might be used for clandestine military purposes. The idea was that alongside the usual conventional material about the local topography, for example, and the best restaurants, a government agency might arrange to embed information of a sort the normal reader would regard as superfluous, but that would be useful for certain purposes. For example, quote, about 170 meters north of the main swimming beach is a quiet, largely inaccessible cove with a sandy bottom, large enough for 2 small boats. A difficult path leads up from it to the left, past a series of small caves, to a hill crest over the city. Riptides are particularly strong here when the moon is full, and swimming is not advised at any time. The person with whom I was speaking claimed that shortly after he published this piece, he received a phone call from someone at a so-called 3-letter agency who said that they found the work solid and interesting, but that they would simultaneously appreciate it if he would publish nothing further on the topic. In other words, this sort of dual-purpose writing and publication was already underway, and the individuals engaged in it preferred that no further public attention be called to their efforts. This story may represent nothing more than a casual attempt to entertain or impress a naive graduate student. But the idea is an intriguing one on which I want to expand today in reference to academic commentaries on ancient literature. A tourist guidebook, after all, is fundamentally a form of commentary which aims to help the user understand and interpret strange new sights, generally by providing a certain amount of basic orienting information, but then going off in its own distinctive direction or directions, discussing architecture, for example, or local life and customs, or restaurants and wine, or the native birds and flowers. There can accordingly be multiple guidebooks for a single place. If one wants to learn about birds, a guidebook oriented to architecture will be of no use. And one can think of rival publications as engaging in a quiet debate intended to open their readers' eyes to what each of them insists is really most important about a spot. At the same time, there may be multiple target audiences for a single guide, some of them explicit, some of them perhaps left deliberately unacknowledged. To be successful, by which I mean to help the reader see what the author of the guidebook believes matters most, the author needs, in any case, to think carefully about their audience or audiences and about their larger goal. A large part of that goal, I suggest, is inevitably to train the reader's mind and eye so that the reader begins to see other architecture or other wineries or rock formations or nesting grounds elsewhere in a richer and more informed fashion. The point is not just to look at this Baroque chapel or this habitat for a rare bird species, but to begin to see the same or related phenomena elsewhere. Okay, next slide, please. To put all this in a different way, with reference now specifically to commentaries on classical texts, the unreflective reader or commentator, when asked to explain the point or purpose of such work, is likely to say something along the lines of, the goal of a commentary is to make a text accessible, in the first instance for students and non-specialist readers who may need help with the language and with understanding the cultural and historical background. There is some basic truth here. Strictly speaking, however, none of this is necessary, for it is possible to imagine a commentary that does not accommodate the beginning or non-specialist reader and that concentrates intensely on one technical aspect of the text instead. The reason almost all commentaries on ancient Greek and Latin texts nonetheless offer some basic syntactic and grammatical assistance, I suppose, has to do mostly with commercial concerns. Publication of a specialist commentary is more easily justified if one also includes generally accessible notes that allow for a broader readership and thus more robust sales. The larger point, however, is that both quite elementary and highly specialized technical commentaries have larger purposes and expectations. Training students to read Greek or Latin carefully and well is, among other things, fundamentally a way of teaching them to read any text carefully and well, which is to say that a commentator's goals are always broader than opening up one particular individual text to use. So too with more advanced notes. The underlying point is to illustrate not so much what to read as how to read, so that the reader is inspired to move on to ask cognate questions of other texts and other situations. To look at this from a slightly different perspective, we as classicists want our texts to be read and read effectively because we regard them as important, as having something significant to say, not just about antiquity, which has vanished forever, but about our world today. To return to the guidebook analogy, basic information about the location of cities and sites and about how to move between them, like advice regarding how to make sense of the construction of a passage of ancient Greek, is a normal and important part of the genre. But providing such information is not what work of this sort is really about. Guidebooks and commentaries have larger goals, or at least larger effects. And since that is so, we may as well be explicit, at least in our own minds, about what we are attempting to have our readers understand and where we are attempting to lead them. That in turn requires reflection on who our audience is and whether we can broaden it overtly or covertly to accomplish our larger purposes. Can we find ways to talk directly to students who need syntactic assistance, for example, while simultaneously, if more discreetly, sensitizing them to other issues we think they ought to regard as important? And can we also address other audiences, perhaps without acknowledging them, in the same way that authors of at least some tourist guidebooks apparently address local sleeper cells of saboteurs and the like? Next slide, please. One obvious means of attempting to bring out the contemporary significance of classical literature for readers of a commentary would seem to be to address its political implications. I recently completed work on a major edition of Aristophanes' Nights, which is a play about, among many other things, demagoguery and its effects on a democratic political system. For an American writing in 2023, it is difficult not to read and present the play in the light of Donald Trump's MAGA movement. I have accordingly made passing allusions to his behavior and rhetorical strategies here and there in the commentary, while the longest section in the introduction specifically treats the play's politics. Among the problems with drawing explicit connections of this sort, however, are that the match between ancient events and modern ones is rarely exact, and that offering specific analogies tends to date the commentary very quickly. My Nights will probably still be in use in 20 years, by which Trump will, one can only hope, be a distant political and social memory. Making the addition insistently about him may thus be effective as a pedagogical strategy for a few years, but it undermines the long-term utility of the text. So too with Prometheus Bound, my other recent commentary project. It is tempting to read the play in light of contemporary political events and present it as a straightforward morality tale of heroic resistance to cruel monarchical authority. Prometheus, the free man, daring to speak out against a police state run by Zeus. That might be an effective way to imagine and stage the play in 2023 in an American or European theater, a point to which I will return to in passing later on. But this interpretation also requires ignoring or suppressing a number of inconvenient aspects of the text, chief among them the fact that Prometheus is not Zeus' lifelong adversary, but a failed collaborator, the man who put Zeus on the throne and now realizes he has made a mistake, and whose ultimate goal is not revolution, but a reconciliation that will allow both sides to maintain their dignity and power. Put another way, overtly didactic political readings of this sort are risky in a number of ways, in part because they are patently tendentious and thus not an ideal means of opening up the primary text to readers with different, although similarly strongly felt convictions about such matters. Next slide, please. Up to this point, I have made three basic points. The first is that our work as commentators is not merely a matter of glossing words, explaining constructions, and providing nominally neutral background information to help make sense of a primary text. Instead, our work inevitably has larger implications and aims, and because this is so, because what we write is not neutral or lacking in ideological or theoretical content, even if we might wish to think it is, we would do well to be explicit about our interests and purposes, at least to ourselves. My second point is that these other projects we undertake when we produce a superficially merely philological, historical, or literary commentary on an ancient text are more likely to be effective when they consist of quiet attempts to convince the reader to think about particular issues or sets of issues, rather than as explicitly didactic programs of interpretation. Repeatedly encouraging the reader to understand Nights and Prometheus Bounds as texts that have to do with political power, or more interesting, because more specific, with various strategies that can be used to confront political power, and how those strategies can succeed or fail, given the status, capacities, and character of the individual actors, as well as how the text itself works to shape our understanding of such issues. This approach may well have a direct effect on how the reader understands not just these texts, but others like them. Directly telling the reader what the text means, by contrast, is likely to produce resistance of one sort or another, and runs contrary to our larger purposes of opening up debate rather than closing it down in any case. Third, considerations of audience and of the possibility of multiple audiences. mean that we ought to be constantly asking not just who we are writing for, but whether there might be ways to expand that envelope. Next slide, please. In that light, and to close my paper, I want to offer two suggestions about areas in which modern philological commentaries can quietly focus with an eye to encouraging thinking about matters of great importance in the modern world, and perhaps even changing minds about them. I will then also offer a suggestion about a concealed audience to which we might consider actively but quietly reaching out. I want to stress that these are only examples. The point is that this is the kind of work commentaries can do if we let them, and a way we can give our primary texts more contemporary impact, assuming that is what we really want. My first suggestion for a strategy of reading in which the reader can be implicitly trained via careful, consistent commentary is drawing attention wherever possible to issues of social and economic status, labor, the power of wealth, and the embeddedness of privilege in political and social institutions. Last year in Yerevan, I presented a paper on clouds in which I argued that a staging problem in the revised version of the play could be partially addressed by assigning a famous and very funny and effective line near the end of the comedy to a slave rather than to the hero Strepsiades. That is a controversial claim, and it may not be right. My point in advancing it, however, was not just to address a technical problem regarding the number of speaking characters allowed on stage in Athenian drama and the relationship between the two versions of the clouds. Instead, what I hoped to do was to encourage the audience, along with the reader of the commentary on which the talk was based, to think about slave characters and their degree of agency on stage. And the larger point of that, of course, is to encourage them to think about slaves in the real world of the late 5th century Athens, and ultimately about labor and power generally. This is the same reason I use quotation marks whenever I mention Alexander the Great in my commentaries. Alexander was not so great, in my opinion, and I want to push the reader to think about the issue for a moment. And in response to the potential charge that this is to wrongly politicize our intellectual work, I maintain that our intellectual work is already political and that we may as well be quietly clear about what we believe, or at least about the questions we believe should be asked. My second suggestion is connected with the fact that comedy in particular is full of references to food, fish, animals, agricultural products, and natural and land-made landscapes. I regard this as an obvious jumping off point for encouraging the audience of a commentary on such texts to read in an ecologically engaged manner by considering how human beings control and degrade their physical environment. I want to be clear again that I am not arguing for preaching about such issues, in part because I believe that overt attempts to control an audience's convictions are more likely to produce resistance than assent, and in part because I'm convinced that these issues are so complicated that it is not always clear what the correct strategies and answers are. What I am arguing instead is that simply bringing such points up again and again by discussing, for example, where tuna were caught and how their ancient migration patterns work, trains the reader to look at texts and thus the world at large through this lens. What we are doing when we call attention to particular issues is creating habits of reading and thus habits of thought, and we may as well do so in the most positive and productive manner possible. Finally, in regard to audiences, dramatic texts are both the isolated remains of ancient live stage performances and the fundamental means by which those plays are revived or recreated in the modern world. If we truly believe in the importance of our material, and therefore in the need to make it widely visible and as useful as possible today, I suggest we might wish to think specifically about the needs of theatrical directors and producers, even when we produce nominally student-oriented texts. Most such comments will pass as directed at normal academic readers. But just as dropping seemingly extraneous information about a quiet cove with a sandy bottom and a path leading to a militarily significant point into a travel guide about a Caribbean island can help the books serve a second audience, which is not merely concerned with the pros and cons of the local beaches, so too extra staging notes, for example, can help modern theatrical professionals stage a play that we, with our own type of expertise, believe would be most effective in terms of what the Greek and the culture that produced it will allow. Such readers certainly come to academic commentaries for guidance from time to time in any case. Why not support them and thus indirectly advance our larger aims of bulking up the contemporary significance of our primary texts? In keeping with my general sense of how to productively approach texts and indeed intellectual and social puzzles of every sort, my goal on this talk has not been to offer fixed prescriptions or orders. Instead, my conviction is that our goal as readers is to ask good questions and to see where they lead, and that our purpose as commentators must be to train our readers, whoever they are, to ask similar questions by modeling the process for them. Given that dynamic, we need to think clearly and carefully about what habits of thought we are attempting to instill and in whom. Thank you.
Thank you. So, any questions? Вопросы?
Аня, можно?
Да, поближе, наверное.
Сейчас.
Hi, Doc. Nice seeing you. So I have probably 2 questions / comments.
Okay, I can't hear you, but
Okay. First of all, I said nice seeing you, Doc.
that's true. I heard that.
Imagined. So thanks for a very thought-provoking paper, I must say. And I have 2 comments / questions. The first one is concerning this, idea of, so to say, multi-layer commentary addressed to different audience and having different kinds of information. And you were speaking about how quietly or indirectly to put in some additional information and things like that. I wonder if the new informational age can change our way of looking at the commentary. Of course, when you are publishing a commentary, when it is a book, it's very hard to make it multi-layer. But in digital era, you can do that. You can address different layers of commentary to different audiences, including even, taking your analogy, the free letter agencies with special access for some of the people if they need it. But in our case, of course, it could be a special access, for instance, for people who can contribute to the commentary. So the commentary could be, fluid. And for instance, the information on Trump or any other short life implications could be dropped, for instance, at some time. So I wonder your attitude to this idea of digital commentary that could make this multi-layer commentary actually working. That's the first one. Maybe you answer it, and then I come to the second one.
Okay, so I think that's really interesting and absolutely right. Commentaries sometimes try to do this by, for example, using font size to indicate that there's things that general readers should look at and then things that
that is more.
Or using footnotes sometimes. That is pretty awkward. But what you're talking about, I think, is this incredible future that we've got as digital products. And I think it really is an idea that commentaries could be stacked in multiple layers, and you could decide essentially how deep you want to go at any one point. So, I think the problem is the more I interact with IT people, the more I realize that their tools are at this point not sophisticated enough to allow us to do all sorts of things that we would like to do. But I think you're absolutely right. This is direction that we want to think about going, and in all sorts of ways, functionality, the ability to click on things and go to places that would be helpful would just be a revolution in commentaries.
Thanks. And the second remark concerns with advantages and disadvantages, of, so to say, modernized commentary. I mean, making allusions to, contemporary economic, political, social issues. Well, it could be both, I would say, advantages and disadvantages at the same time. Although I say that, well, Russian experience of this kind of commentary, well, is not so, well, it's not so good, I would say, because Aristophanes, for example, was very popular to commentaries and books in the Soviet era, because he was taken as, representing the working class ideas of Athens, and it was all over, and it made these books, I would say, a little bit. Now we are reading them with a lot of skepticism, to say the least. So that's one of the problems I see also even now. And my question is, don't you think that these allusions have, and it is both, I think, advantage and disadvantage, have first, or maybe have some also, as you said, commercial implications. First of all, it's, if you allude, you draw a broader audience. People became interested, but that makes your work a little bit lighter than it should be, I would say. And the second thing also, which makes me a little bit awkward about this approach, it's the way of, also commercial in a sense, but immaterial maybe. It's a way of proving our profession to be relevant for the today's audience. I'm not sure we have to prove it in this way. So I'm a little bit skeptical about this attitude as an attitude. Of course, sometimes you just can't help it, and that's But I think that the audience is clever enough to sometimes to make these allusions without being pushed to make these allusions. That's my point. Thank you.
Okay, so what you're raising is a really fundamental question about what we do and how we do it. My conviction is that all commentary writing is embedded in a particular place in a particular time. There's no way that we can make our work neutral. So pretending that we can somehow avoid these issues, that's not realistic. Now, what you're talking about with this, for example, this Soviet era deliberately propagandizing, if you will, Aristophanes, I agree, and that's part of my point. I think that's counterproductive, in the same way that it would be counterproductive to make an edition of Knights all about Donald Trump. It's counterproductive because, number one, it limits the sell-by date, if you will, of the text, and it also means that as you said, 30 years later, somebody comes along and thinks, this is either this is completely dated, this text, and I want nothing to do with it, or I disagree entirely with the political views expressed here, and therefore I want nothing to do with this text, right? So we've defeated our own purposes. But nonetheless, I'm going to come back and say, I think the fact is that you cannot write the kind of things that we write without having that embedded in who we are and where we are. It's inescapable. And this is, one reads older commentaries and realize, aha, what they see going on here. Now, they may not say it expressly, but that's what's going on. So I think we just owe it to ourselves and to our audience to be very clear about the fact that we are embedded in a particular time and in a particular set of social and political and cultural concerns. And let's think about that because, and again, I'll say it one more time, we're doing it anyway, right? You can't escape this. And so you might as well think about it when you're doing it and make sure that you're doing it the best way possible.
Questions?
Давайте. I have 3 questions, if I may, please. The first is, what was the bearing of the Japanese girls on the slide?
Korean.
I didn't quite get it.
Sorry, will you repeat the question?
What was the meaning of the Japanese girls?
Okay, I can answer that.
Korean.
Okay, so I'll answer that first. So part of how I like to make my PowerPoints multi-directional and interesting is dropping little cultural memes in. And so the point of that little cultural meme was simply saying no, 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 right? No, 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 do this. So that was the reason for drop. And all of them are intended to be read on this kind of, ironic pop cultural level.
Well, the second question is about, well, it appears from your presentation that you can think of the commentator's attitude when he is about to comment something that is more interesting to him, the grammar and so on. His attitude as if of one carrying out a clandestine operation. It seems that such motives are considered by you as ulterior ones. Is it not possible to pursue one's goals, so to say, outspokenly, not not so covertly as your talk supposes?
Yeah, I think this goes back, if I'm understanding the question correctly, this goes back though to the issue that Nikolai and I are we're talking about, which is how productive is it to be direct? In other words, persuasion sometimes works best when it merely suggests things, merely points in directions, and it works best, first of all, because the reader is less likely to resist that. And also because it's an open way of asking questions instead of a directive way of asking questions. So what I'm trying to do is suggest a way that we can think about things that really matter to us. One of my best example, as far as I'm concerned, being eco-critical readings, right? Readings that have to do with man and his interaction with the natural world, and just suggest to the reader by modeling it that these are questions that need to be asked and the questions that need to be asked of every text. I think that's more productive than saying to the reader, look, we've got an ecological crisis here. You need to think about tuna fish. I don't think that's helpful, right? I think it's much more useful to just get the reader going down this particular road. And I think that's what we've got much more power to do, is affect the way that people read texts. And again, and I'll repeat what I said when I was interacting with Nikolai, this is something we do anyway, right? In any case, we are teaching people how to read when we write commentaries. So we may as well think about how it is that we're doing it and what directions we're asking them to go in. And I think you had a third question.
People don't like ulterior motives when they understand them as such.
Well, all right. So this gets to a very interesting question about, how open one needs to be. But you know what? We don't begin our commentaries in any case with an explicit statement of purpose, right? We have an implicit statement of purpose, which, you know, it turns out often we agree or disagree about what it is. But I would say, again, we're doing it anyway, right? You don't start your commentaries with a declaration of your political and social goals. It's not how any sort of text works. Texts always are doing this kind of under the surface. So again, I'll respond and say, we do it anyway. We're doing this anyway, right? We're influencing people anyway by the way we talk. And I'm actually asking for more openness in the sense that I'm asking us to think about what it is that we're doing rather than just, you know, thinking that we're behaving in a neutral way, which we can't.
Thank you very much. And the last question is, well, what in your opinion, a modern theatrical director can do, if at all, to put on stage the women of the Thesmophoria, to make it really suitable for today's audience? Well, you know, I see from your commentary, your endorsed commentary to the comedy, which I like very much, that you're very sensitive, though not very explicit, about the points, well, about the sensitive points of today's agenda, let us say, about women and slaves and other kinds of oppressed groups. But this comedy, if not adapted for the modern audience, it seems to me, or rather the humor in this comedy, the literary play put aside, is, well, its humor suits only the most ribald Bulgarian, in my opinion. And if presented on stage as it is, it trembles on every point of humane attitude as we understand it today. Because women are not given their due even within the framework of patriarchal system of values. So what would you think about this point? I mean, what a modern director can do to adapt the play, if at all?
All right, well, first of all, I'd say it seems to me that actually the biggest problem with Thesmo is not that. From my point of view, the biggest problem with Thesmo is that it requires so much literary background, so much appreciation of Euripides, for example, that you almost have to have a lecture before the play to make it work. But that's another way of saying you're right. There are huge cultural barriers, right, between these texts and the modern world. What I would really say is that this is a case where there are different roles for different people in this process of bringing these texts out to the public. I would say the kinds of things that you're talking about are precisely the sorts of skills and gifts that theatrical producers have and that we don't. I don't know that I'd know how to adapt Thesmophoriaceae to make it work in 2023 in Moscow, right, or in Bari, or in Minneapolis. I'm not sure I have the answers. Fortunately, right, that's not my job. My job is to hand these texts off to other people who are in fact theatrical producers. And this is, you know, I can essentially see us as a middle stage here. The thing those people are going to do is they are actually the ones who are going to transform the play into something that's immediately relevant to a contemporary audience. So, for example, I can very much imagine someone taking my edition of Knights, right, which has some political points, but is not intended for, you know, for immediate relevance to 2023, taking it and translating it into a performance put on stage right now, right, that is about Donald Trump, that has the sausage seller, you know, dressed up like Donald Trump with the yellow hair, you know, and the red tie and all that. But that's not my job. My job is somewhere in the middle. My job is to make this kind of thing possible. And this is why I stress this idea of putting enough in those commentaries that somebody who's interested, for example, in staging Thesmo, understands the play in a very rich way and is kind of guided to what seem to be some appropriate staging conclusions, but does it themselves, right? So again, I'll just say essentially, thank God this is not my job, but thank God that I believe that they're really out there who this is what they do, and I want to make it possible for them to do that.
Well, thank you for the candid answer. I would rather say, if I were asked the same question, I would answer that I would rewrite the play.
Well, I think that there's a sense in which that is what every director does, right? I mean, you know, all sorts of things have to be changed, and the question is how much is changed and how much is kept contemporary. I mean, I'd love to see a production of Birds, for example, that really, you know, was about a couple of white guys, right, wandering into this place in the backwoods and realizing, right, how they could turn this beautiful paradisical place into a, you know, a money-making operation, right? That would be so funny and so topical. But as you just said, you'd have to rewrite it, right? You'd have to rewrite it. And then the question becomes, of course, you know, when does it cease to be Aristophanes' Birds and when does it become something else? But I think this is how staging ancient texts always works. They're always, right, made relevant to the audience in one way or another.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No? Okay, so if there are no more questions, then we thank Professor Olson and move on to the next speaker, who is Boris, who has just appeared.
Да, да.
We will stop the recording and restart it each time.